introduce a very talented individual. And when the program's over, Ashley built the new exhibit about the Underground Railroad, which is in the back right, or back behind you on the right. She is a senior at Colgate University, history major.
Yeah.
Yes?
Yep, history major.
And I have worked with a lot of interns in my years, and this one's got talent. So, I'll turn it over to you.
Hi everyone, thank you so much for being here. It's an honor to be here to speak on the research I did, and thank you for those who are tuned in on Zoom. I know some of us can't be here, and I appreciate those who made the effort to come out, especially in these challenging times. So over the summer, I was an intern here. For those of you I haven't met, I am Ashley. I am a history major, writing minor at Colgate. I'll be graduating this year, super exciting. But today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about my research process here at Oneida County History Center and how I came to study the Underground Railroad and its emergence in central New York. So the Underground Railroad is something we all learned about growing up. I feel like it was one of my most exciting things to learn about in school. It's just like this secret thing, and you saw these people taking such drastic measures to make it to Canada to get their freedom. And I think the story is just moving because it kind of relates to the American dream, something we've all thought about. And we're all moving to this better democracy. It's something we talk about in school and something our founding fathers always prioritize in freedom. So what I knew about the Underground Railroad coming in was that it was a series of safe houses spanning from the south to the north into Canada, and slaves would take it going with groups to make it to Canada eventually. So you had the conductors, most notably Harriet Tubman. I think we all got to watch a documentary on her in school. And you had the station masters, the people you'd see hiding these people, risking their lives. They really tried to embellish how these white Quakers and just random people along the way assisted these people toward their freedom. And of course, their homes were the depots. See, as I got to research here, I found a file on the Oneida County Freedom Trail Commission. My apologies. Can you hear me now? Okay, is that a little better? Okay. So the Underground Railroad was one thing I learned that responded to the Fugitive Slave Acts, which required northern states to return fugitive slaves back to the South. Many Northerners didn't want to do it, but it went up to Congress, and they kind of forced the Northern hand in returning the enslaved people back to the South to their slave owners. So Canada ultimately became the only region in the North American continent to be the place of freedom for these people, these men, women, and children. So the Underground Railroad is actually something that happened in central New York, and I never knew that growing up. I knew that routes went through to Canada, but I never realized that it went through the place I lived in every day. So I wanted to figure out how central New York played its part in the Underground Railroad. So New York abolished slavery in 1827, and at the time, New York had some slaves, mostly domestic servants here, and in 1827, many of those were released from their bondage, and some settled right here in New York, mostly in Rome and Utica. One of the most notable places was Post Street, which is still existing. It's a tiny little avenue. If you go there, you'll see the Oneida County Freedom Trail sign, which is an amazing development. And as a result, Utica became a prominent historical site in the freedom struggle in U.S. history. So here we have some photos of some notable places here in Utica. You have the Bleecker Street Baptist Church, also known as the Second Presbyterian Church. You have the old Oneida County Courthouse, and you have a newspaper clipping of Post Street. There's very few photographs that exist. But if you all are interested in learning more about these stops in the Underground Railroad in Utica, I really encourage you to take a photo of that QR. It'll send you to a link of a virtual tour, and you can just read about these places. I got to partner with the Oneida County Freedom Trail Commission to develop this, and it's just such an amazing thing. You have photos, you have information, and it's just a great spot to see the places you visit every day, like Utica Coffee or like Johnny's Pizza, like that little Bag Square district right there. It was an amazing site for the freedom struggle with the Utica Rescue and notable people. So I really encourage you to look that up. So the Underground Railroad, in my very brief experience with it here at the History Center, was not just a route to freedom, but it was a movement that I saw shared by free and enslaved groups, Black, white, men and women working together to find this goal of universal freedom in this developing republic following the Revolutionary War. So I knew that this place existed. I knew that the Underground Railroad happened here, but I didn't know why. And I think that what really drove my research, because I knew that the Underground Railroad was a movement that emerged, but I didn't know how or why. And as a history major, the biggest question I always ask myself is how things happen. To understand the story of the past, we have to dig deeper to see how the past actually happened. So I had to do what can I do with these ideas? The only thing I could do was more research. So the Underground Railroad just didn't pop up. It came out of a series of developments starting with the Yankee migration. And then the Erie Canal, the completion of the Erie Canal really facilitated this movement because it allowed the East and the West to connect, and it allowed people, ideas, and goods to just transport back and forth throughout the state. So then New York State, just 2 years after the Erie Canal is completed, abolishes slavery. And then we see this development of benevolent societies or religious societies develop in Utica and across the nation by the 1830s. These spaces gave people the platform and the opportunity to express religious ideas and really act on this new evolving understanding of religion. And then one significant figure that I learned about based on the research of Milton Cernett, who's a professor at SCU, he really did a lot of research on Beriah Green, who was the president of the Oneida Institute, or the Whitestone Seminary following George Washington Gale. He was a really prominent leader driving this movement in a way that's so unique from most people in this area. And then we have the New York first anti-slavery convention in 1835. So I began asking myself these questions after I built this timeline. Where did the sentiments come from? Who were the actors driving the movement? And why did the Underground Railroad come through New York? There had to be some reason that it happened here. So I had to engage my research in the following ways. So I have had to read a couple of books. As a student, I am endowed to the secondary literature that I read. And this quote really stuck with me. The subject of religion has broader significance in this period and locality than might at first appear. This section of New York was the storm center, and the religious forces were the driving propellants of social movements important for the whole country in that generation. So this quote comes from Whitney Cross, and this kind of introduction to the Second Great Awakening, for those of you who don't know, it was a religious movement in the late 18th century, mostly in the 19th century, that really changed the idea of religion. People began to view religion as something that we had to actively engage in if you wanted to reach your salvation. So that was my starting point. It was the Burned Over District, which most of you may know started in Western New York and kind of migrated to Central New York. So the Yankee migration was an early migration from Connecticut, mostly upper northeastern states, moving into New York following the Revolutionary War as the nation was depopulated with the war and people began moving across the country. People who came here, some were young, some were old, some were families, and they had to settle this new territory and begin their new life.
Sorry to interrupt. Got somebody trying to get in.
I saw that and I wasn't sure what to do.
There. Sorry.
Thank you, Patrick. So yeah, the Yankee migration was this mass movement, and beginning in the 1790s into the early 1800s, where people began to move into New York after the wars. And what facilitated this movement across New York was the Psychic Highway, which was the Erie Canal. The completion of the Erie Canal in the early 19th century made central New York this vibrant population. At the time, Utica was only known as Fort Schuyler. It was a frontier settlement, very small, very rural at the time. And once the Erie Canal was built, it allowed the city to become this industrial center for many men, women, and newly settled migrants. And along this canal, and especially with the Chenango Canal, it kind of became this highway for crusaders during this time. It created a very unique environment for many people, and I think that it really highlighted what Central New York had to offer. So at the close of the Second Great Awakening, Oneida County could no longer be characterized as a community whose constituting element was the patriarchal household. The obvious alteration of the old New England ways was the splintering of the Christian community into an assortment of religious sects, whose members were recruited on the basis of inheritance, not on inheritance, but voluntary association. The social as well as the demographic structure of the Canal era was conducive to the development of voluntary associations, and an instant city like Utica was too volatile to support the invincible and cohesive ruling class. And what that means is that the Canal, creating Utica, created a city that didn't adhere to the normal rural social structures that you would see in Western New York, the original destination of these New England migrants. Many of these people were families. They oriented their lives based on families and their social bonds within them. But in Utica, these people could really develop their own independent nature. Women could go out and have social positions in like these benevolent societies. You see Sunday schools forming and women leading these movements, and men were out there joining, they were joining labor unions and doing their part in achieving their American dream. And unlike the rural West, you could see social and economic tensions building. You can see class structures rising and falling based on the rural and urban divide along the canal. So in 1821, you could just see how vibrant the urban city was becoming. You had 21 societies existing in Utica alone. So the world to the Utican man and woman became a world they could reflect in the idea of their creator. And these are newspaper clippings, directory clippings from the 1828 directory. And you can just see how many people were going out to join these unions and societies. And while these societies reflected religious and spiritual callings, over time they evolved to take on a more democratic character. Men and women were able to hold positions. They could become treasurers, they could become secretaries, they could have social positions that distinguished them from other people. And it was an amazing development here in Utica. So it was only a matter of time before these benevolent societies and reform unions became more in depth with the ideas growing across the nation. They began to take on the democratic character that characterized the Republican era in American history. And right there in the Declaration of Independence, you see the sentence that all men are created equal. How could this be possible? Many questioned when we had a population of men in bondage just in the South. And these contradictions, many drove the fight for the abolition cause, because not only did it violate the rights of man, but people felt, many people felt that because slavery existed, that our rights, even as white Americans, were not guaranteed. So, of course, the abolition struggle was an important event in history, and many people did believe in equality, but at the same time, many of these people were looking out for their own interests. But I think the most notable character was Beriah Green, who really changed the game. He wasn't just an anti-slavery member, he really drove the abolitionist cause in Utica. And anti-slavery diverges from abolition because anti-slavery just doesn't believe in the institution of slavery, whereas the abolition cause really advocated for equal rights, for integration, to admit African Americans into schools, to give them the same rights as you and me. And I think the Whitestown Seminary, the Oneida Institute, is a great, an amazing example of this idea of equality. So Beriah Green came to New York after his time at the Western Reserve College in Ohio, and he took over the Oneida Institute after George Washington Gale. George Washington Gale was the president at the time. He created this seminary for men who would pay off their tuition with labor and manual labor. What drove Green here is the idea of manual labor because he really believed in honest work. So here, Green kind of brought with him his abolitionist ideas that he developed at the Western Reserve College. And he allowed the Oneida Institute to carry on this he allowed the Oneida Institute to become the center of the abolition community here in Central New York. Many students, even at this college, were advocating for equal rights even before Green stepped foot on their campus. So we could see how integrated and how evolved this city was becoming. So with Green arriving, he established the first anti-slavery convention here. And many of you know Gerrit Smith. Many of you may have seen his bust here. And he is proclaimed as one of the most leading forces in abolition here in New York State. However, Green sort of drew Smith into this cause before he even joined the anti-slavery convention because Smith was a little unsure of how to deal with the question of slavery. He was actually not a member until Green kind of forced him to come. He's like, come, here are our ideas, maybe we'll take on this cause. He believed that, he was a part of another organization that really thought that the way to deal with slavery is to send the enslaved population back to Africa instead of letting them remain in the US. This was the Colonization Society. And after hearing Green speak at the anti-slavery convention, he joined the cause because he felt like this was the right movement. And then you could see his commitment with his gracious donations to the cause and giving land to many African American communities to develop the nation. So I think the connection between religion and abolition is very strong. We believe, right here, this is a quote from the Anti-Slavery Convention Society. Right in the Constitution, they stated, "We believe that it is always safe to obey God and to deal justly with men, and that the immediate abolition of slavery by those who have the right to abolish it would be both safe and wise, and that contrary course will endanger our," sorry, that was a typo, "our civil institutions and provoke upon this nation the just judgments of heaven." So you can really see that, there are sides. You can see the democratic nature of the abolition movement, but at the same time, this was very religious. This discretion that happened on earth wasn't only a human and social development, it had implications in the spiritual realm. And the only way to correct it was to take the proper course of action through anti-slavery and abolition. So the Underground Railroad ultimately was the beginning of, is the surface level of an already brewing movement. So it started with the Second Great Awakening, and it built up to this moral reform, and it was propelled by the Canal being put into Utica and going across the western and eastern portion of New York State. The rise of benevolent societies, which surpassed the 30s in Utica alone by the 1820s, were an amazing accomplishment in New York State and central New York especially. So all these things emerged from responses to the social and democratic nature that solidified in the early Republican era in American history. So abolition was just one of many civic movements that emerged out of this movement to purify the nation of its social ills and put it on the track towards like a more benevolent and secular and proper nation state. Yeah.
You guys have any questions for us?
Yeah, I'm sorry, that was some technical difficulties there. Yes.
You did a lot of research, certainly it sounds as if, and it sounds as if you're going to continue to do more. Had you run across any names, I'm sure you did, of people in Utica that were part of, helping the enslaved people get free, part of the Underground Railroad? Any prominent individuals that you can name?
Oh yeah, so right where Utica Coffee is, that stretch of land right there, there was Alvin Stewart, who was a lawyer, I believe. Jan, I think he's this lawyer, right? And he was going to defend two runaway slaves from the South who came into New York. But Judge Chester Hayden, he was the Oneida County judge who wanted to send these two men back to the South based on the Fugitive Slave Acts. And Alvin Stewart was one of the most notable men who stood up and offered to defend these men, even though they weren't given the right to like a trial based on their status in the United States. He and Spencer Kellogg were two who also ran a dry goods store right next to Utica Coffee, who witnessed this whole thing go down. Those were two men. Sorry, I kind of twisted my words. So you have Spencer Kellogg, who was a dry goods store owner, and Alvin Stewart, who was a lawyer who sort of tried to propel the rights of these two men to a trial and prevent them from being sent down to the South. And thankfully, those two men didn't get sent back to the South. They were saved by some Post Street residents. Post Street was the African community here in Utica, and they broke into Judge Hayden's law office, and they rescued the two men, and they were able to make it out of central New York and stay along the course of freedom. Yeah. Sure.
Two questions. Do you have any idea about numbers of people moving through Utica? And the second question, the stations, which are the places where people live. What was the housing like? Were they hidden? Were they disclosed?
Okay, yeah. Yeah, I do. So if you guys do check out the virtual tour, there's a lot more information on that. With that, Patrick has a link. He can probably like distribute that to more people. But many of the fugitives were hidden kind of in closets, behind bookcases, like wherever they could hide. If you guys know where Pho My Kong House of Noodles is, there was John DeLong, a Utica resident who lived there. It wasn't a restaurant or anything at the time, it was his private residence, and he just had people like living in the, or hiding right in his house. And they would just kind of just sleep there and then move along. So they didn't really have to hide that much unless someone came in to check, but yeah, they didn't really have to hide. So what was your other question? I don't know the numbers. Jan, he runs the Oneida County Freedom Trail Commission. He has a number of like resources and, Jan, do you know?
I briefly mentioned what we found out. We have found out at least 250 freedom seekers were in Oneida County at one time or another long enough to answer a question on a U.S. Census so that they lived here at some point. We know of at least 50 other people who were enslaved who passed through here, including the people that Ashley mentioned, the two people who were rescued in the Utica Rescue, and we have many other stories. At least 300 African-American freedom seekers found a place in and about Oneida County. That's we can count, okay?
Yeah, it's hard to tell like the numbers because we don't know exactly where all these people came from, but there's amazing research done by his foundation. If you guys want, there are pamphlets right next to the exhibit that will be super helpful. Oh, and Patrick has some in his hand. Did you have a question?
I did. It's more of a contribution, and it will be probably an extended conversation with you later.
Yeah.
But I ended up purchasing a building that is 3 years in almost into renovation right now, along Student Park. The building right next to it is, right now it's kind of like a men's boarding house. And this one is one family house. It's the kitty corner from it is what is now called the historic apartments. But before that building was there, was the Utica Armory, the old Utica Armory. And that area was the building I can track back to 1862, it might be older. And I believe, okay, from the guy who's lived in the building next door, he says that his building was the officers' quarters of the first, the Utica's, there was a group of Utica militia kind of people.
Oh, like for the Civil War, the volunteer corps? Okay.
Right. And they trained and marched in what is now Student Park, doing their drills there. Many of them went off to fight in the Civil War.
Yes.
The building next to me, I mean, the building that I'm fixing up, probably was a high-ranking general or somebody. And it's got all these like lookout tower areas. It's very interesting, so you can just like see the Mohawk Valley. And I think it merits more investigation. But the key was there was a Fugitive Slave Act, 18 whatever, and what? And Utica residents were, well, New York State residents were barred from helping fugitive slaves. So one of the things that the homeowners might have done is, and this is a feature in this building, there's a trapdoor that closes off the top from the basement. And then there's a side door where there's entry into the basement. So they just sort of close off the basement, and anybody who needed to shelter there could. And this particular building has what might have been a root cellar, but looks an awful lot like a nice little hiding spot and bedding spot for me. So
yeah, okay.
I think you should take a look. The other building has other nooks and crannies kind of like that.
Yeah, so we're not really sure if like these like hiding places were like actually used for like fugitive slaves, but there were rumors that the Oneida Institute actually had these like hidden spots for fugitive slaves to hide as like a college, and the female seminary by Hiram Kellogg also was said to have like these hiding rooms for fugitive slaves. Those buildings don't really exist anymore, so we can't actually look at them. And then I know there was a church in Syracuse that sort of had an underground tunnel or underground like basement where it was said fugitive slaves hid. And you could see, I think their faces were like engraved almost onto the like imprinted on the wall. It's like the Wesleyan Church. I think you might want to look it up. It's kind of cool to see like these people like their presence there. It's just so hard to like see their traces here in Utica, especially because a lot of the buildings here are torn down. But that's an amazing. I'd love to learn more about that after.
What do you mean their faces are engraved?
If you look it up, you can see like, yeah,
Oh, okay.
yeah.
Artistically, it's not like
No, it's not like they stuck. Yeah, no. Yeah, it's really hard to describe. Like if you like Google it, you'll see it. Yeah. I'm sorry, yes?
How many states did this, was this in effect? And I know when we were in Massachusetts, Salem, at the Nathaniel Hawthorne House, we saw the hiding places in the house, right on the water there.
Yeah.
And it's so interesting, but right across the whole north, apparently, predominantly, were the places
Yeah.
that had this place. In 1827, I thought it was later that it was the abolition happened.
So 1827 is when New York State abolished slavery. So abolition didn't really start yet. It was only when the state abolished it, and after that, it was kind of like a catalyst for abolition activity, at least in Central, like in New York State. Yeah, because those sentiments were already brewed.
Leaders then in doing this.
What's that?
We're one of the leaders in
Yeah.
the state and
Yep.
establishing this. And for religious, a lot of religion was involved in this.
Yeah, it was very religious. It wasn't really like democratic in nature. Like it wasn't like egalitarian ideas. It was more spiritual forces driving this movement. People were using this cause to further their own salvation, mostly. That's not to say that all people didn't have like these beliefs, but it was very religious in nature. I think the North, what's that?
When you're taken back in time, in those times, it's amazing to study the history of this.
Yeah.
Of anything, really. And of course, the Canal opened in 1825,
Yep.
so it all came together
Yes.
quite a bit.
Yeah, and the Canal was one of the reasons what many of the fugitive slaves came through Central New York, because it was a waterway that they could take to move up the state and throughout it. What's that? The Mohawk connects into the Canal throughout this region, so yeah.
Religiously, the Quakers were very much involved.
Yes.
And they would use language like friend.
Yes.
Indicator that you were sympathizing to the abolition
Yes.
movement.
We actually have a paper that was printed at the Oneida Institute called The Friend of Man, too. It was an abolitionist paper throughout like Central New York, so that's one of a contingency here in Central New York.
And then, I don't know, I missed the whole presentation, but part of this, there's of course a lot of intersectionality. A lot of the abolitionists were suffragettes as well.
Yes.
So the whole women's rights movement, which I guess Seneca Falls gets more credit for it, but that was happening too. You happen to know the Underground Railroad ended up being very important to the actual railroad, and Harriet Tubman's claim to fame was actually riding fugitive slaves on the railroad. So that's another reason why I think that those two buildings, and there was a third one that got knocked down, were part of the Underground Railroad, because it's not that far a walk to the train station.
No, right. Yeah, it's very interesting to see how these geographic and social developments combine, especially here in Central New York because of this time period. Yes, sir.
Two comments. You should remember that the Utica Rescue happened about 13 years before the Gerrit Rescue.
Yes.
And they made such a big deal.
Yeah, I didn't.
They have a monument and everything.
Yes.
Maybe Utica could take a cue from that.
Yeah, I didn't include too much on that, the Underground Railroad here in Central New York because I do have the virtual tour, but
Could you repeat what's said with you after the question?
what's that?
Would you please repeat the question?
Repeat the question.
We can't hear the people who are asking.
Oh, yeah.
Just summarize what they're asking.
Oh, he was making two comments about the Utica Rescue, which took place here, and it was the rescue of George and Harry Bird, or I think I might have mixed that up, but they were two fugitive slaves who were runaway going north throughout Central New York. They stopped here in Utica, and they were actually caught by two slave catchers, and Spencer Kellogg, a dry goods store owner, overheard these two men being retained by the slave catchers, and he sort of started making a scene right near Bag Square in Utica by Utica Coffee, the Johnny's Pizzas and stuff. And Spencer Kellogg demanded that these men have the right to a trial before they be sent back to Virginia. And Alvin Stewart was a man who stood up to represent these two men, and they would later go to the Oneida County Courthouse to have a trial. But the trial didn't really matter because these two men were rescued by Post Street residents who broke into Judge Hayden's office and rescued the men and allowed them to continue moving north to Canada. And then the Gerrit Rescue was something that happened in Utica, or in Syracuse, I think in the 1850s. I think 1853 or 1858, somewhere around there. And it kind of took on the same processes that happened here in Utica, but Jermaine Logan was one of the participants in that, who were rescuing 2 men, or I think it's just Jerry, sorry. But there is an amazing sculpture in Syracuse that commemorates this moment. And if you just Google it, you can see this. Yeah, Jan?
To respond to your question, why is it form made of the Utica Rescue? 2 points. First of all, it is now recognized by the National Park Service's Network to Freedom as an official site on the nation's underground railroad. No other place in this county of Oneida has a site that's recognized by the National Park Service. So if you look up the National Park Service and you say underground railroad, that place will show up. Second of all, we are about to erect a sign right in front of the building of the Utica Rescue that will explain all of the stuff that she's been explaining. It's going to be part of our walking tour of Utica's Underground Railroad. So it'll be the last sign. It's not up yet, but it will itself identify that building and explain it afterwards. So we are, in fact, making a big deal.
What are you going to do?
Well, I've got a designer working on that last sign. Oh, well, there's a long story behind why we haven't finished with that sign.
Got one more question, and Ashley will be around to answer more questions. We got one more. Ashley?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I'm just going to pull up the slide with this QR for you guys to take down if you want for the virtual tour. Yes, sorry. I'll give it to you. I'm sorry. Sorry, go ahead.
In 1997, we celebrated the bicentennial year of the village, and I was on the bicentennial committee, and things popped up and we began crawling around in the records that existed. And one was a bill of sale from Pascal DeAngelis, who was a founder of the village. And he'd been involved in the sugar plantations down in the Caribbean. Sounds like he was an entrepreneur. And this bill of sale was for his slave, whose name, I can't think of the worst name for a slave, was Patience. And she was sold to a Mr. Miller in South Trenton. So we did have a slave in the village of Holland Patton from his earliest days. Across the street, ironically, is the Ballou House. And local folklore was that it was a station on the Underground Railroad. Well, when the Ballous sold it, and there was an open house, I went up there and went into the house and just asked, you heard that there was a hidden chamber for runaway, for slaves on the Underground Railroad? And they said, oh yeah. And one of them led me up the back stairs, and sure enough, there behind a wall was a room. And he said, that's, as far as we know, that's where slaves could hide.
Yeah. Central Newark is not no stranger to slavery. We had General Herkimer right north here, or I think east. Sorry, I'm terrible with directions. But he had his own slave development going on in Herkimer, and he is one of the most well-known people for the Revolutionary War and stuff. So.
Now, can you explain why the slaves had to be hidden? I mean, supposedly we were in a...
So the Fugitive Slave Acts, even though the state abolished slavery, the Fugitive Slave Acts were still in place. So the South would send out notice that their slaves were missing, and they would demand that they be sent back. And the North had to oblige based on the federal law. So as a federal law, it didn't matter if the state abolished slavery; they still had to abide to it. Yeah.
I only have anecdotal knowledge about the meeting at Second Presbyterian Church, and it was, as I remember, interrupted by the city officials.
Yes.
Begged them to leave because it was a riot.
The Utica Riot, yep.
And I went to Peterborough, and I always thought, we know more about, that's a long way, Peterborough.
Yes.
How many of them just gave up, or how many went, what did they do when they got there? They stayed, there weren't that many houses.
Right, and it was right at Gerrit Smith's house. So for those of you who don't know, the Utica Riot, at the state held the anti-slavery convention here in Utica in 1835 at the Bleecker Street Church. It's the Second Presbyterian Church. But the city at first granted the anti-slavery society to speak there and hold their convention. But because of the controversy that arose in Utica about this meeting, the city decided to revoke their permission for the anti-slavery convention to speak there. So, but they were already there, so the people decided that they were going to go on with their convention. And many prominent Uticans, like people who held office here in Utica, went outside the church and started throwing stuff and rioting the building because they didn't want the anti-slavery convention to take place here in Utica. And as a result, the meeting was interrupted because it escalated very quickly. It was very violent, and the group just decided to move to Petersboro because Gerrit Smith stood up. He's like he decided that the words they were saying here had enough meaning that he wanted to take it on to Peterborough at his private residence to continue this movement, to continue this discussion. And it is a very far trek. I don't know if you guys know where Peterborough is. It's about 30 miles the opposite way. I go to Colgate, so it's further than Colgate's.
It's on Route 31.
Yeah.
Road, right?
Yeah.
Past the night.
Yes. Jan?
Some rode Canal as far as Syracuse, and then you have the highway carry. Some highway carry all the way. Some walked. Some rode the horse. You get around. But eventually, 400 of them made their way to Peterborough. The cultural community took people in, fed them. They finished the convention and then dispersed. But it was, you know how big Peterborough is. But 400 of them made it, and it was raining.
It's amazing their commitment.
400.
Excuse me.
Yes.
When they reached Canada, do you know how they were received or what happened?
So Canada welcomed many slaves. There was actually a Peterborough in Canada too that kind of was attributed to the Peterborough in here. So once they reached the border, they were accepted as citizens, and they were no longer subjected to the federal Fugitive Slaves Act. So yeah, there was a lot of African American communities that settled right in the beginning of Canada, especially around New York State. Yes.
You can't stress enough that if you did help fugitive slaves, you could be imprisoned.
Yes.
In jail.
Yeah.
It was a serious offense towards the federal government.
Yeah, because of how problematic it was for the South, they were so angry by fugitive slaves making it north and not being sent back. They kind of pushed Congress to take these drastic measures to enforce slaves being sent back down to the South. So it was very risky for many people to hide these people, even though slavery was abolished here in New York State. So it is despite the conflictions that abolition rose, the people who were involved in protecting and sheltering many of these fugitives risked their livelihood for that. And you can see that here in Utica. We have Alvin Stewart, Spencer Kellogg. We have many, many more people who are doing that, and they're prime examples of what Utica has to offer here.
I think that's why it's so hard to find out if you were Underground Railroad site, if you didn't want people to know.
Right. And that's why it was so hard to put together an exhibit just on the Underground Railroad, because there's not much we have that resonates what happened here in the 19th century because of the stakes it was, being a public friend of these fugitive slaves and sheltering them and moving them along their course to freedom. And that's why I had to pay tribute to the movement that started it all, with the Second Great Awakening and the social reform movement that built up to this.
Give me a hand. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much.
Before everybody gets up and goes, My name is Rebecca McLean. I'm the executive director here, and I just want to echo Patrick's sentiment and thank you all for coming. Ashley has been a stellar intern, a stellar student, just a stellar human being to have worked with this summer. She didn't tell you, but I mean, she went above and beyond. She was only given 10 weeks to research and design this exhibit. She put together this presentation. She put together a presentation for high schoolers along with this tour. So she has done so much that she didn't even tell you about. So please stay, check out the exhibit, come ask Ashley more questions, have a conversation with her, and thank you so much for coming.